So this tour was led by Hannah, and Hannah was great. She was an awesome tour guide. I think so. Said she was an acting student, a younger person maybe, a recent grad, I guess. She's been doing this for 2 years, and I thought she was very funny. She definitely had her own spin on things, and there was times where she'd say like, I don't even need a, I'm not even supposed to tell this story, or oh, this is just something I personally find really funny. And she also was a fan of puns, so she loved to throw in some puns there, just being silly and stuff like that. And so I thought that was great. She certainly had a flavor. And, it is a case where sometimes you get a tour guide who's very by the book, will give you all the facts. And I think she did do a good job of personalizing the experience. And there was an extent to, though, I think, so she was plain clothed, right? And so I think there was an opportunity lost there, just because I think when I think about the best tours I've ever been on, it usually is what I think can best be described as the French waiter experience that is mentioned in the book Pitch Anything, which is a really great book talking about how to talk to people. But it's this idea that you like the tour guide, you want to some degree to be otherized from you, the viewer, in the experience. Sort of like when you're playing Dungeons and Dragons, you don't want the dungeon master to feel like another player, because then it doesn't feel like there's a whole menagerie of monsters and people and non-player characters with their own experiences and imaginations behind the board. It just feels like your friend Bob who's pretending to be those people. And so I think you want to have that transformative, that teleporting experience where you're like, oh shit, like I'm in a world where ghosts exist, or I'm in a world where we're playing Dungeons and Dragons, and dragons are a real thing, And I think having a plain clothed, sort of down to earth, very personable tour guide is good in some respects, but I think it actually does hurt the experience overall. Because when I think about the best tours I've ever been on, it's been with guides who are a little bit off. They're a little bit loopy. They believe in ghosts. They've seen ghosts. There's someone in their family who is currently a ghost. That, it sounds silly, but that could be transformative in really defining the experience, because in many ways, like, this is a tour, but it's a tour shown through the perspective of your guide. And somebody who is giving you a tour of the Freedom Tower in New York City, that's going to be a very different tour if it's somebody who served as a firefighter on the day of 9/11 and rushed into the building and pulled bodies out. One is very factual and one is experiential, sentimental, and I think that all really can do a whole lot to flavor the experience. And I felt like that was really lacking here. She didn't, like, there was no point where she was like, I personally have experienced this ghost here, and this is something that happened. And it's something that we'll talk about a little bit later, but or we could talk about it now. But it's this weird thing that happens when these tours have been around for long enough. So she says she's been doing this tour for 2 years. I don't know if there is an exact time, and I think to some degree you can architect this. But if you've been doing this tour for 10 years, and I've been on many tours that have existed for quite some time, 10, 20, even more than that years, they can speak to experiences that didn't happen in history 50 years ago, but happened to them on this tour, X amount of years ago. And it's at that point in time that the tour really becomes an experience on another level. Because now it's not a tour of a haunted building. It's a haunted tour of a haunted building. The tour itself becomes haunted, and it takes on the role of that experience. And I think that is just another level, which this tour, it's like a fine wine. Maybe it needs to age, or a cheese that needs to age. It's like a sponge. If you can imagine a sponge that is being used to clean up something ugly, something evil, something smelly, something putrid. And you wring it out. And then you wash it. And then you wring it out. But after you use a sponge, as if you have a sponge in your kitchen, you've done this, after maybe a little while, you can't get that smell out of the sponge. The sponge smells like motor oil, or the sponge smells like whatever you were sponging up. It's taken on that scent. And the tour hasn't yet done that for me. It hasn't yet become a part of what it is, a part of the magic, a part of the spooks. And I think there's a lot of ways to do that. But I think one of the things is the character itself. It's the tour guide. And unfortunately, I don't think it's at that level. I thought the stories. So what is a walking tour for ghost stories? It's basically a procession of stories which may or may not be strung together by a coherent narrative. And so the most common way that these stories will be tied together, I mean, obviously, it's a walking tour, right? So if you've got places to visit and they are located such that you have to go to A, then B, then C, you're going to tell story A before story C. But there's a lot of nuance and story craftsmanship that can go into telling those stories so that they do run coherent. And unfortunately, that was not the case here. The stories were consistently average in terms of scare factor and spookiness, and just general bravado and showmanship. But I would say that they were a little short with respect to consistency. It was hard for every stop felt like a different experience in that sense. And that, I think, is another thing that prevents a tour from being on another level, right? So, for example, I went on this tour where, as always, these tours start at the same point that they end, okay? And this particular tour, we were looking at this building, and they were saying, there was a ghost that was in this building, and she told this beautiful story about how these kids were in a Ouija board thing, and they decided to turn off the lights. And when they turned off the lights, one of the women felt that she was being pulled towards the southern wall, like a hand had come out from the wall and had pulled her up against the wall. Ooh, spooky, right? And then we continue the tour. Then the final story, we're now on the other side of that building, the southern side of the wall. And she explains that this storefront used to be a morgue, and they found out that instead of properly disposing of the bodies, they were taking the bones and putting them in between the walls, pretending they had properly done the cremation service, but actually they had just put the bones in the walls. And we believe that from that very first story I told you tonight, where that woman was dragged against the wall, it was one of the spirits that was trapped in this wall, begging, not trying to harm her, but begging desperately to be heard for a way out. Right? And suddenly, oh wow, like you could just imagine how that felt. You had that first experience, you spent the tour thinking about it, digesting it, and then that last experience, that last story, tied it all together in a beautiful bow that not only complemented the geography of the space, which was obviously, logistically, we have to walk around to get to the other side of the building, but it also thematically provided this great conclusion to the story and to the narrative in a way that is only more harrowing. And this tour had nothing of the sort. There's nothing even close to that level of, I think, artistry with respect to how the stories are being told in the right order. So, for example, probably one of the most compelling stories here is that they're starting off in the some sort of plaza. I don't remember what it was. It might have been Washington Square Park. And there's 20,000 bodies under that park. And the story is told, I think, fairly well in the beginning. But then we end at that same place, and there was no cherry on top. There's no resolution to that story. There's no callback. And I think that was all not good. I think there's really an opportunity there for us to come back with poignancy and with power. And unfortunately, I don't think that was being delivered there. I think the one story that was a standout from this experience was the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory. And certainly that's a story with, there's no excuse here. This town, New York City, holy shit. Like how much crime has happened in this place, it's insane. There's certainly been serial killers and lots of spooky shit, right? That's gone on here. So there's no lack of content for sure. It's an issue with how it's been told. That I think maybe not an issue, but there's an opportunity for significant growth. I think in the opportunity here. So, for example, the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory story was great, and you could tell that Hannah really engaged in some bravado there, just in how she told the story. Right? There's this moment in the Triangle Shirtwaist story, of course, a very famous narrative where these people are trapped in a building, and some of them have to jump to not die because it's literally a burning building and the fire escape has fallen down. So you could jump or you could wait and burn to death. Wow, what an amazing opportunity for a ghost story, right? And she says there was an elevator shaft. However, it was too slow. And so what some of the women chose to do was jump down the elevator shaft. And while the people who were in the elevator, they heard thump, 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 as the bodies from those above them that had chosen to jump fell to their deaths, colliding with the elevator 25 stories below them or whatever, right? Boom, boom, boom. The cracking of the legs, the bones, whatever, right? And so that, I was feeling it there, I was getting a little bit of the good ghost vibes. And I was like, shit, that's fucked up. That's good, So I was enjoying that experience, but the other stories really didn't hold a candle to it, and I don't think anything else was really at that level. There was a little bit of I would say emergent experiences that happened on this tour, which is always really fun. I mean, I've been on tours where they've had paid actors pop up with full costumes, dressed up as ghosts and stuff, skeletons and things like that. Nothing of the sort here. This was very low budget, one person the whole time. And, it is what it is, right? But there was a fun experience where some rats in the streets came up to our tour and crawled between the legs of some of the people who were on the tour. Some big-ass New York City rats, and that's some scary shit, right? You can't make that up. So that was awesome. We love a good rat, right? And almost every other tour or tourist experience, you're going on a wine tasting, you don't want to see a rat. But on a horror, spooky ghost hunt, we want to see a rat. Hell yeah, man, that's some scary shit, right? So that was awesome. I love that. And it really gave a good little spook to people. But what I look for most when I'm going on these tours is something which I guess you could call a follow factor. It's not a scare factor, which is, I think, a little pop and then you get spooked. But it's a story, a thought that is so harrowing it follows you home. And you think about it when you're at night tossing and turning at sleep and you can't sleep because the story was so spooky, right? And so there wasn't really a lot of that, I think. The Triangle Shirtwaist was getting at that a little bit, but I would have loved more. And then I think another emergent sort of and that scare factor was that maybe Fiero is what they'd call it in game design, there was random people walking around in sort of real Halloween regalia, and you'll see videos of that I'm showing. But that was awesome just because it is, of course, the eve of Halloween, and so there was a lot of spooky stuff happening there. And yeah, that was all a good time. The architecture was amazing, so there was a real opportunity here, which I think was well seized, on exploring some of the beautiful architecture of the Greenwich Village. We looked at some of these buildings, which were just jaw-droppingly gorgeous. We also had a little bit of a touching upon, there's so many things that a tour can touch upon, especially on a city as famous as New York City. And so there was a little bit of the movies going on where she touched upon a church that was the setting for the movie Lady Bird. So that was kind of fun to say, like, oh, this was filmed there. And that's all a good time. Just as the Jack the Ripper tour in London, we'll talk about how some of the Harry Potter inspirations came from this area, and so I think that's always a nice thing for people to touch upon. And then we also saw a celebrity sighting, which is a fun thing, I guess, in New York City. So we went to this building, which was purchased since by the famous news journalist, the Anderson Cooper, right? And so his husband was actually in the window and he gave us a wave. So that's a little bit fun, right? To see a celebrity or what goes for a celebrity these days. So that was a good time. Um, yeah, I think though in general, I didn't see the landmark locations capitalized to the degree that I've seen other tours capitalize on similar or even lesser known locations. So this Washington Square Park thing with 20K bodies, that's pretty amazing. There was another story in the Philadelphia tour, if you go on the Philadelphia Haunted Tour, where it's a similar thing, right? This is very common for a park to be a repurposed cemetery. But there was a great story there of this woman who would come every night and would walk around and prevent people from digging up the bodies because in the the Great Depression or whatever it was, people would want to dig up the bodies and steal the gems and jewels of the deceased that they were buried with. But this woman would walk and she would like, guard the dead, and people would follow her home, but they never found out where she lived. And so there's just a great little story and a narrative and a folk tale, folklore that gets into it. One of the things in general that I think I love about ghost stories is it's one of the few ways that I think tourism is keeping alive folklore. And my gosh, the United States has such a rich history of folklore. Things like Johnny Appleseed, right? Paul Bunyan, these tall tales. But particularly, I mean, Headless Horseman, of course, a good one, relevant to the spooky nature of this all. But I think it's great to find ways in which we could keep those folklore alive. And so I would have loved a little bit more of that. No supporting media on this tour. I think that's a real bummer. And it's because I've seen so many tours that have had the experience amplified by the tour guide whipping out an iPad and showing you a picture of what this building looked like in the 1800s. And there's no excuse to not do that here, particularly for people where I think most people going on this tour are not there for the paranormal phenomenology. They're going there for the history, which is a huge draw for this tour. I mean, in many ways, a ghost tour is a historical tour with a little bit of a spooky side, right? And so to see the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory and then for her to hold up an iPad saying, this is what it looked like 100 years ago, whenever it was, the event. And this is what it looked like, an artist's rendition of what it looked like the day of the catastrophe. I mean, it brings it to a whole nother level. And there was nothing of the sort there going on here. It was pure imaginative. And I think a use of supporting media, whether it's an iPad or I've even seen print out laminated cards that they'll hand out to the viewers for them to look at and then hand back, that can all leverage the experience to another level. And again, it's just not engaged here. Yeah, not really a scare factor. There wasn't a lot of spookiness going on besides the rat, which wasn't planned for, but hey, I'll count it. And then I think there was really no follow factor with respect to giving me a little ghost to walk home with, right? And we've seen that on tours before where they say, hey, man, I've had people on this tour at this spot we're stopping at now take a photo of this door and zoom in. And in the glass, they have seen the face of the man who haunts here. And I actually have a picture of what one of those photos looked like, that one of my tour, people who went on my tour, they sent it to me after the tour, and this is what it looks like. Now I challenge you, take a picture and bring it home with you. And when the clock strikes 12 or whenever, or later when you're in your bed, it might not show up right away, but look at it before you go to bed. Zoom in, and you might just see a face in the glass. Something like that where you're taking it home. There is an opportunity for you to engage with the story even beyond it and to be thinking about that. Or, hey, just to do something, right? To say to people, hey, take a picture. You might see an orb here. I think that's all really wonderful. It's all really magical. And it's not happening. Again, this is all really going towards what I think can best be described as... So... maybe you've seen the film Harry Potter. Okay, in the film Harry Potter, he goes to a museum of sorts, and there is a snake beyond the glass. And he leans in close because he thinks the snake is saying something to him. And in a moment that can only be described as magic, the glass disappears and he falls into the snake pit. This tour felt like going to a museum, reading a plaque, observing the snake beyond the glass. But I did not at any time feel like I had fallen into the snake pit. And there have been other walking tours where I have had that experience, right? Where they've pulled me into the adventure and suddenly, oh shit, not this place is haunted, and not this place was haunted 100 years ago, but this tour is haunted. This night is haunted. And it just brings that experience to the here, to the now, and to a level that's supernatural. So I really did enjoy this tour. Though obviously a critique is going to focus a lot on the critical side. This tour, if 5 was genre defining or best in class, and 4 was great, something that you're going to think about years to come, or just bringing it back, I guess. Experiential, bring it to another level. I think this tour was probably a 3 out of 5. It was average to above average, and I think there's just so many opportunities that I think it can grow further, that I would love to see a little bit more bravado, a little bit more storytelling brought into here. And some of those ideas I think could bring this tour certainly to a 4 or even a 5 out of 5 with the right guide. Regardless, I'm going to give the tour a big 5 out of 5 on, TripAdvisor or whatever that is. So I could say that Hannah did a great job, and she certainly did. But I think compared to every tour I've been on, and I've been on a lot of tours, I feel that there's probably other tours in New York City that are offering a higher level experience and a little bit more spook factor for your buck. So if you went on this tour, I'd love to hear what you think. And if you're just a fanatic and enthusiast of ghost tours, I'd love to hear how some of my comments may have resonated with you with respect to what makes a great tour and what sets the favorite tour of yours apart from maybe others that you've been on. Thanks.